June 7, 1944, Normandy coastline, dawn. The sea was calm, but the silence was uneasy. From the cliffs near Port-en-Bessin, a German artillery spotter peered through his field glasses. Just 24 hours ago, this stretch of the French coastline had been open water. No docks, no ships, no infrastructure. Now a floating city had appeared overnight. Massive concrete blocks sat anchored in the surf, forming an artificial breakwater. Long metallic causeways snaked out from the horizon like spider legs, connecting to strange platforms bobbing in the waves. Cranes were already unloading tanks, trucks were rolling onto French soil. The harbour, if that's what it was, looked permanent. And yet, they had watched it arrive. Not by magic, by towboats, hundreds of them. Barges, pontoons, steel bridges, everything prefabricated, everything planned, everything impossible. Until now. The German officer lowered his glasses. For weeks, his commanders had insisted the Allies couldn't land in force without seizing a major port. But now, staring at this industrial miracle rising from the sea, he realized something far worse. The Allies hadn't needed to take a port. They had built one. From scratch. In silence. Overnight. To understand why the Mulberry Harbors were revolutionary, we need to rewind 2 years to a failure the Allies never forgot. On August 19, 1942, British and Canadian forces launched a raid on the heavily defended French port of Dieppe. The goal was to test the feasibility of a large-scale amphibious assault, and perhaps to boost morale. What they got instead was a massacre. In just a few hours, over 60% of the attacking force was killed, wounded, or captured. Tanks became trapped on pebble beaches. Infantrymen were mowed down before they reached the seawall. The port defences held firm. There was no room to maneuver, no backup plan. The lesson was brutal, but clear. Storming a defended deep water port was suicide. But that left a strategic conundrum. If the Allies wanted to return to Western Europe, to launch the long-promised invasion of Nazi-occupied France, how could they supply it? The entire endeavour would be doomed if they couldn't offload troops, tanks, ammunition, and food at scale. They needed ports, desperately. And Hitler knew it? That's why the Germans fortified every major harbour on the Atlantic coast, Le Havre, Cherbourg, Brest, Calais, with massive concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, underwater obstacles, and beach mines. These were part of the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile chain of coastal fortifications built to repel an Allied invasion. Capturing one of these ports would cost tens of thousands of lives, and even if captured, they'd likely be sabotaged beyond use. So, by 1943, Allied planners faced a terrible question. If we can't take a port, how do we bring one with us? The man who dared to answer it was Winston Churchill. As early as May 1942, before even the Dieppe raid, Churchill circulated a secret memorandum with a radical idea. Its title, Piers for Use on Beaches. In it, he proposed constructing a system of mobile harbours, floating docks, breakwaters, and roadways that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled off the French coast. His words were blunt and visionary. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. At first, many military engineers scoffed. The tides off Normandy were strong, the weather unpredictable. How could a fleet of floating concrete structures survive the open sea, let alone support tanks and trucks in battle conditions? But Churchill wasn't asking for permission. He was giving orders, and British engineers got to work. In secrecy, with almost no precedent, teams began designing components that could be built in shipyards and assembled like a giant maritime puzzle. The operation had a code name, Mulberry. It would take 2 years, millions of tons of steel and concrete, and an army of welders, planners, and visionaries. But if successful, it could turn the tide of the war. because without it, D-Day might not work. Even the initial landing was just the beginning. Experts estimated the invasion force would need 12,000 tons of supplies per day to sustain itself. Beaches alone couldn't handle that volume for long. Without a reliable unloading system, the beachhead would stall, and the Germans would have time to regroup. So, by late 1943, Mulberry became one of the most critical and secret operations in the Allied arsenal. Not a weapon, not a tactic, a miracle of logistics. The Americans had doubts. General Eisenhower initially preferred capturing the port of Cherbourg, but British planners insisted there was no margin for error. There was no time to waste fighting for a ruined harbour. Mulberry was not just an experiment. It was the only option. Back in Berlin, the German High Command still clung to their assumptions. The Allies would need a port, and the Atlantic Wall would hold. Their strategy depended on it. But in hidden bays across southern England, a silent revolution was underway. The Allies weren't just preparing to invade Europe. They were preparing to build the impossible and float it straight into Hitler's fortress. The Mulberry Harbors were not born from a single blueprint, but from a whirlwind of competing ideas, prototypes, and improvisation. From 1942 to mid-1944, the most ambitious logistical project of the war took shape in utmost secrecy, scattered across the British coastline. Churchill's vision had lit the fuse. But turning that vision into steel and concrete required a coalition of military engineers, civilian contractors, naval architects, and logistical theorists, many of whom had never worked together before. Their collaboration wasn't always smooth. The British War Office split the effort into separate experimental programs, each focused on a different component: breakwaters, piers, floating roadways, anchors. What emerged was a coded nomenclature that would soon become legend. Phoenixes, giant hollow concrete caissons designed to be sunk offshore to form breakwaters. Gooseberries, a line of deliberately scuttled old ships, block ships, that would create a calm water zone for unloading. Whales, floating steel roadways that could bend with the tide. Beetles, buoyant pontoons that supported the whale roadways. Spuds, pierheads with adjustable legs that could rise and fall with the tide. It sounded like children's toys. But it was war engineering at its most radical. The goal was staggering: to offload thousands of tons of equipment per day onto beaches without a port in one of the most tide-sensitive regions in Europe. By mid-1943, engineers began building full-size prototypes in locations like Garliston in Scotland and Bracklesham Bay in Sussex. Test runs were chaotic. Roadways twisted, caissons cracked, anchors dragged. Some designs failed completely, but they kept testing. And by late 1943, the Allies reached a key decision. They would build not one, but two complete Mulberry Harbors. One would be assigned to the Americans, Mulberry A, and the other to the British and Canadians, Mulberry B. Both would be towed across the Channel immediately after the D-Day landings and deployed off the respective invasion beaches, Omaha and Gold. To protect the plan, Allied High Command instituted maximum secrecy. The harbors were camouflaged, compartmentalized, and referred to in vague, misleading terms. Even among the men towing the parts, few knew what they were building. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies worked tirelessly to prevent German reconnaissance from spotting the assembly work. Luftwaffe overflights were intercepted. Misinformation campaigns added noise. And because the Germans still assumed the main invasion would land at Pas de Calais, their focus remained dangerously misaligned. Behind the scenes, friction between British and American engineers slowed some progress. The US preferred steel structures, the British leaned heavily on concrete. Disagreements over anchoring systems, pier construction, and towing protocols nearly derailed aspects of the plan. Yet the deadline remained fixed. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Everything Hundreds of components, thousands of men, millions of man-hours had to be ready for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. And so, by early May 1944, the final pieces were being towed from shipyards and coastal yards across the UK. Convoys of blocky, strange-looking structures began to move, down rivers and into assembly zones along the southern English coast. Locals were kept away. Censorship teams kept a tight grip on the press. One of the most ambitious elements was the Phoenix caisson. Each was a concrete giant, some over 200 feet long and weighing up to 6,000 tons. They were hollow, sealed for buoyancy, then towed by tugboats. Once in position, valves would open and the caissons would sink, forming a protective wall against waves and artillery shells. Military planners debated whether the harbors could be assembled quickly enough under fire. But there was no alternative. German coastal artillery, Luftwaffe raids, and rough seas were all expected. What no one expected, not even the Allies, was just how quickly the harbors would rise from the sea, and just how stunned the Germans would be when they did. By June 1st, over 150 Phoenix caissons, dozens of gooseberry ships, and hundreds of Beetles and whale segments were staged for launch. And as the sun rose on June 7, 1944, the morning after D-Day, they began to assemble something never before seen in human history. A man-made port, floating on the ocean, under fire, in real time. The invasion had landed. Now came the next phase. On paper, the Mulberry Harbors were an engineering marvel. But in the chaos of war, with artillery shells falling, tides shifting, and men dying on the beaches, they were also a logistical gamble unlike anything ever attempted. And yet, they worked. The genius of the design lay in its modularity. Instead of building a single massive port, the Allies created dozens of floating parts that could be towed independently, then connected offshore in less than 72 hours. Each component had a purpose. Each played its role in a symphony of steel and seawater. Let's break down the system. Before supplies could be offloaded, the waters near the beaches had to be calmed. This was the job of the Phoenix caissons, enormous concrete blocks, shaped like hollow barges, towed into position and then deliberately sunk. Each one weighed thousands of tons. When placed side by side, they formed a solid seawall stretching miles along the coast. In tandem came the gooseberries. Old cargo ships and destroyers stripped of value, sailed across the channel, and then scuttled in place. These rusting hulls became additional barriers, absorbing wave energy and creating a calm lagoon behind the artificial walls. The result? A protected anchorage zone off an open beach, where none had existed before. Once the breakwaters were in place, the real magic began. Engineers deployed the whale roadways, floating steel bridges that could stretch over half a mile from the shore to anchored pier heads. Supported by Beetles, buoyant pontoons, the whales flexed with the tide, but remained strong enough to carry tanks, trucks, artillery, and men. The roadways led to spud pier heads, equipped with legs that could rise or fall with the tide. These served as stable platforms for unloading ships regardless of water level. Each harbour had multiple pier arms, allowing for simultaneous unloading operations from several Liberty ships at once, a miracle of wartime logistics. One of the most underappreciated elements of the Mulberry operation was the mathematics of the tide. The Normandy coast has a tidal range of over 20 feet, meaning any rigid system would be rendered useless within hours. British engineers solved this by allowing the pierheads and whale bridges to float and flex. The Beetles absorbed wave energy. The whale spans were built with special hinges that bent and rotated without cracking. Anchoring systems were adjustable, with cables and chains calibrated daily. This flexibility made the system viable in one of the most tidal battle zones in Europe, an achievement modern engineers still study today. On June 6th, as Allied troops stormed the beaches, the first Mulberry convoys were already underway. hundreds of tugs, flat-bottom barges, and naval escort vessels began towing the Phoenix caissons, gooseberry block ships, and whale components across the channel. Despite the threat of U-boats, mines, and Luftwaffe attack, the majority arrived on schedule. And beginning on June 7th, the very morning after D-Day, Allied engineers began deploying the parts. Within 72 hours, both Mulberry Harbors were partially operational. By June 9th, British engineers at Gold Beach had already offloaded tanks and trucks via the whale piers. American forces at Omaha were doing the same. The speed was staggering. In less than a week, the Allies had constructed 2 artificial ports, from scratch, under enemy fire, on foreign soil. Despite all this movement, the Germans were caught off guard. Why? Because they never believed it was possible. Their planners assumed no one would dare try to tow harbors across the channel. Their intelligence reports mentioned strange constructions along the English coast, but dismissed them as decoys or experimental training structures. Even when blocky shapes began appearing offshore after D-Day, many German officers thought they were temporary barges, not the beginnings of a fully functional port. That underestimation would cost them dearly. Because the real battle in Normandy wasn't just being fought in the hedgerows, it was being won in the surf by steel, concrete, and the quiet genius of engineers. While the Mulberry Harbors were an engineering triumph, their impact extended far beyond logistics and blueprints. For the men on the ground, Allied soldiers, German defenders, local French civilians, what unfolded off the beaches of Normandy felt like something out of science fiction. The harbors did not just function, they defied belief. For thousands of Allied troops storming the beaches on June 6th, survival had been the only goal. Machine gun fire, mines, and mortar rounds had turned the shoreline into a killing field. Many who made it inland that day still expected chaos to follow. But then, just a day later, they watched piers rise from the sea. From landing craft and dugouts, soldiers looked out and saw lines of tugboats, hauling strange, barn-like structures toward the coast. Within hours, cranes were swinging into position. Flatbed trucks rolled down steel causeways. The beaches, once clogged with debris and bodies, began to transform into a bustling, organized hub of war logistics. To the men waiting for ammo, food, and reinforcements, it felt like salvation. To many, it also felt like magic. Letters home described it as surreal, unreal, and like watching a city grow from the ocean. For soldiers hardened by years of battle, this was a moment of unexpected hope, a reminder that someone, somewhere, had planned for them to survive. On the German side, the reaction was one of disbelief, followed quickly by alarm. In the first 48 hours after D-Day, Wehrmacht commanders assumed the beachhead would be temporary. They anticipated supply problems would slow the Allied advance. After all, without a deep water port, how could they possibly sustain such a massive force? But when Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights finally photographed the growing harbor structures, panic set in. A German report dated June 9th stated, "Enemy constructing pier systems offshore. Rapid deployment. Function unclear. Must be deception." By June 10th, that illusion had shattered. Radio intercepts confirmed that heavy vehicles and fuel were flowing directly onto the beaches. The Allies weren't improvising. They had brought a port with them. Some German officers described it as a Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon, not of destruction, but of construction. It was the one thing German strategy had never planned for. Rommel, in particular, had long warned that the invasion had to be stopped at the waterline. If the Allies gained a secure foothold and could supply it, the war in the West was lost. Now, watching as that supply line literally grew out of the ocean, he reportedly muttered, "We have underestimated the enemy's mind." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had advocated flooding beaches, planting mines, and fortifying every mile of coastline. But even he had assumed the Allies would need to seize a port within days, likely Cherbourg, and that his forces could concentrate there. Instead, he faced a logistical nightmare. By the time German forces counterattacked at Villers-Bocage and Carentan, thousands of Allied tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces had already rolled off the floating roadways. Mulberry had not just extended the beachhead, it had fortified it beyond assault. Rommel's requests for reinforcements were delayed. German command hesitated. Hitler, still obsessed with Calais as the real invasion site, refused to reallocate key panzer divisions. Meanwhile, British and American forces were unloading hundreds of tons of material per day, protected by Phoenix walls, behind gooseberry barriers, across whale roadways. Beyond the tactics, Mulberry delivered a psychological blow that resonated across both sides. For the Allies, it proved that planning and imagination could triumph over brute force. It symbolized a new kind of warfare, where industrial creativity became a strategic weapon. The harbor was not flashy. It didn't fire bullets or drop bombs. But it won the logistical war in a single stroke. For the Germans, it was demoralizing. Their concrete bunkers had been bypassed, their assumptions shattered. Their soldiers watched helplessly as the enemy built cities on water. A captured German officer later said during interrogation, "We had trained for tanks, for paratroopers, for ships, but no one told us the Allies would bring an entire port." And yet, the most dramatic moment was still to come. Because just when it seemed nothing could stop the harbors from fueling the Allied juggernaut, nature intervened. The morning of June 7, 1944, dawned cool and grey over the Normandy coast. The thunder of naval guns had softened. The beaches were now held, tenuously, by exhausted Allied troops. But just offshore, a second phase of the invasion was beginning. It was less visible, but just as decisive. The Mulberry Harbors had arrived. At first it seemed like chaos. Tugboats swarmed the surf like insects, dragging massive concrete caissons, the Phoenixes, into position. Command boats barked coordinates. Divers plunged beneath the waves, preparing for controlled sinkings. Meanwhile, rusting cargo ships, old Liberty hulls, British freighters, decommissioned destroyers, were deliberately run aground and scuttled to form gooseberry breakwaters. From the beaches, it looked like ships were sinking by accident. They weren't. Every position had been pre-planned, every angle accounted for, every inch of depth, every meter of coastline, mapped and measured. The Germans, watching from beyond artillery range, were confused. Even as aerial reconnaissance revealed dozens of vessels gathering offshore, their commanders assumed the Allies were simply offloading emergency cargo. But on the morning of June 7th, the illusion cracked. Because what rose from the water wasn't debris, it was a harbor. All along Gold and Omaha beaches, Allied engineers worked in shifts, waist-deep in cold water. They operated cranes, tightened chains, monitored tidal charts. Massive Phoenix caissons were flooded and sunk into position one by one, forming a jagged crescent that arched out from the shore. Each caisson was over 200 feet long. When filled with water, it sat on the seafloor like a fortress wall, breaking the tide, creating a lagoon of calm water behind it. By midday, over 24 were anchored. Behind them, the gooseberry ships groaned as seawater rushed through their hulls. Smoke rose from their chimneys one last time before they listed and settled on the sandbars. Within 24 hours, the coastline had been rewritten. Next came the whales, the long, floating steel roadways. Each span was 80 feet long, bolted end to end like a railway, track laid upon the sea. They were supported by floating pontoons called beetles, which flexed with the swell but held the roadways steady enough to carry trucks, artillery, and jeeps. Crews on small boats maneuvered the spans into place like colossal Lego bricks, using floating cranes to hoist and lock joints. Engineers worked under fire from sporadic German artillery, some wounded by near misses or debris. On shore, spud pier heads, floating docks with adjustable legs, were driven into the sand and stabilized. These served as the landing points where Liberty ships could moor and unload directly onto the floating roads. By June 9th, vehicles were rolling directly from ships to shore. No port required. From their observation posts further inland, German artillery spotters radioed reports back to high command. One noted with alarm, "Enemy has constructed pier arms. Structures appear semi-permanent. Supplies flowing at scale. This is not temporary." But it was already too late. More than 16 Liberty ships offloaded at Mulberry Bay, British, within 48 hours. Thousands of tons of cargo, munitions, fuel, rations, medical supplies were flowing in. British and Canadian engineers worked day and night, despite fatigue and sniper fire, to expand the causeways. The harbour, still growing, was already functioning better than Cherbourg or Le Havre, without the loss of a single Allied soldier to its seizure. By June 12th, just 6 days after D-Day, the Mulberry Harbors were in full operation. Over 20,000 vehicles had landed. Nearly 170,000 troops had come ashore through beaches and floating piers. More than 100,000 tons of equipment had been offloaded, all of it without a single traditional port. The Germans were stunned. Their entire strategy had hinged on bottling the Allies at the beaches. But with Mulberry functioning, that bottleneck was gone, and the war machine was moving. But nature, unlike the Germans, wasn't impressed by engineering. On June 19th, just 13 days after D-Day, the Channel erupted into the worst storm in 40 years. Winds gusted over 65 mph. Waves rose more than 6 meters. The beaches of Normandy became a watery battlefield once again. Overnight, the Mulberries were in jeopardy. Pierheads were ripped from their anchors. Whale roadways buckled, beetles snapped free and sank. Ships broke loose, crashing into the very structures they had helped assemble. WWII, the American harbour at Omaha, was hit hardest. By June 22nd, it was declared destroyed. Mulberry Bay, the British harbour at Gold, was damaged, but salvageable. Crews rushed to reinforce it. Steel was cut and re-welded. Roadways were patched with spare spans. Tugboats pulled beetles back into place. Repairs went on round the clock. The question now was simple. Could one harbour support the entire invasion? The answer would shape the next phase of the war. The storm that struck the Normandy coast on June 19, 1944, was not just a freak of weather. It was, for the Allies, a sudden and brutal test, one that no engineer had fully anticipated. For 3 days, relentless waves smashed into the fragile skeletons of the Mulberry Harbors. Winds howled across the channel, tearing mooring lines. Rain lashed the coast. Seawater surged over the causeways. Ships capsized or dragged anchor, slamming into Phoenix caissons and whale roadways like battering rams. By the time the skies cleared on June 22nd, Mulberry Bay, the American harbour at Omaha Beach, was in ruins. Whales lay twisted along the sand like broken bones. Beetles floated half-submerged. The harbour's pierheads had been wrenched apart and scattered. In less than 72 hours, the U.S. had lost its primary offloading point, a catastrophe that threatened to unravel the entire Western advance. General Omar Bradley called it a disaster of the first magnitude. And yet, the invasion didn't stop, because Mulberry Bay, the British harbour at Gold Beach, was still standing, damaged, bent, bruised, but still operational. As soon as the storm passed, British Royal Engineers and Canadian troops sprang into action. They worked in waist-deep surf, welding torn joints, hammering new anchors into the seabed, scavenging broken whale segments from Omaha to use at Gold. They had no choice. If Mulberry Bay failed, there would be no artificial harbour left. The Allies would be forced to rely solely on open beach landings, vulnerable to tide, weather, and enemy fire. But the engineers did more than repair. They reinvented. They doubled the number of beetles beneath key spans, added diagonal bracing, and reworked anchoring systems to reduce drag. When replacement parts ran short, they cannibalized damaged components and reshaped them on the spot. Within 5 days, a reduced but functioning Mulberry B was back in action, offloading tanks, jeeps, and crates by the minute. Churchill, upon hearing of the recovery, said it embodied the supreme quality of the British war effort: tenacity under pressure. Even without its American counterpart, Mulberry B surpassed expectations. In the 10 months following D-Day, it offloaded 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, 4 million tons of supplies. At its peak, over 7,000 tons of material per day flowed through its whale causeways. To put that in perspective, the average deep-water port in Europe before the war had not handled that volume daily. This was not a stopgap. This was a port, built in 3 days, damaged in 3 hours, and salvaged in 5. That became the beating heart of Allied operations in Western Europe. It allowed armoured divisions to reach Caen. It sustained the push into the Bocage. It fueled the breakout from Normandy. It made Operation Cobra, the drive across France, possible. All from a harbour the Germans had said could never exist. German command, once convinced that without a real port the invasion would stall, now faced an irreversible reality. The Allies had not only built a harbour, they had built redundancy into it. When one Mulberry was destroyed, the other absorbed the load. When storms shredded the structures, human will rebuild them. Rommel, increasingly isolated from Hitler's decision-making, grew despondent. His warnings about the need to crush the beachhead in the first 48 hours had gone unheeded. With the Allies now unloading at scale, and with German reserves stuck near Calais, the tide had turned irreversibly. In a report to Berlin, one German staff officer wrote, "We have lost the coast. We may still fight for the land, but the sea is no longer ours." The survival of Mulberry B and the Allies' ability to pivot from the loss of Mulberry A was more than luck. It was proof of a new kind of warfare, flexible, modular, and industrial. The war had entered a phase where the side with the fastest supply chain would win. Not necessarily the biggest guns, but the most fuel, the most food, the most spare parts. And thanks to a floating harbour, the Allies had all three. By late July, German commanders no longer debated whether the Allies would break out of Normandy. They only asked when and where the next disaster would fall. Because the miracle wasn't just that the Allies had landed, it was that they had brought everything with them: roads, cranes, fuel lines, and docks, and planted it on enemy shores. By the end of June 1944, the Allies had not only secured their beachheads, they had established a permanent logistical backbone on enemy territory. And that changed everything. The success of Mulberry B allowed the Allies to do something unprecedented in military history: sustain a mechanized, armored invasion force entirely from temporary infrastructure off an open beach in hostile territory, without seizing a single intact port. The original invasion plan had estimated a 14-day supply window from beach landings before progress would stall. But Mulberry B, battered yet functional, extended that window indefinitely. The numbers spoke for themselves. By July 1st, over 850,000 troops had landed in Normandy. Over 148,000 vehicles had been offloaded. Ammunition, fuel, field hospitals, and even prefabricated runways arrived through the floating roadways. Thanks to the harbour's capacity, Allied commanders were free to expand operations inland without hesitation. The drive on Caen, the bloody campaign through the Bocage country, and eventually Operation Cobra, the breakout into open terrain, all hinged on one reality. Supplies were arriving faster than the Germans could destroy them. What had once been the Germans' strength, the Atlantic Wall, now became their prison. Without control of the beaches or sea, German reinforcements were forced to move overland, under constant aerial bombardment. Every Allied truck that rolled off a Mulberry pier meant one more artillery. Battery deployed, one more fuel truck refilled, one more armored column ready to move. The harbor turned the invasion from a gamble into a grindstone, a slow, relentless, attritional campaign the Wehrmacht couldn't match. While Cherbourg, finally captured on June 26th, remained heavily damaged and mostly unusable for weeks, Mulberry B filled the gap and exceeded expectations. Had the Allies waited to take a port, or relied solely on open beaches, the timeline would have slowed dramatically. German counterattacks could have pinned the Allied forces near the shore, but the Mulberry Harbor eliminated that delay. It bought time, the most precious commodity in war. Before Normandy, amphibious invasions relied on capturing pre-existing ports. After Mulberry, the playbook changed forever. The success of the floating harbor proved that military engineering could create opportunity, not just support it. That logistics was not a background task, but a front-line weapon. The operation also validated Churchill's early vision. That imagination, not just firepower, would shape the outcome of total war. Even skeptical American generals came to acknowledge the harbor's role. General Eisenhower later said, "The Mulberry operation may well be called the secret weapon of the Normandy campaign." Because while paratroopers seized bridges and bombers softened defenses, it was steel piers and rolling convoys that won the day after. Every tank that liberated a French village, every ration that kept a soldier moving, every shell that silenced a German gun. Most had touched a floating dock that didn't exist 2 weeks earlier. As the weeks passed after D-Day, German High Command was forced to confront a bitter truth. The invasion had succeeded, not just tactically, but logistically. And much of that success could be traced to a structure they had never imagined, a floating harbor that shouldn't have worked, but did. For months prior to the invasion, Hitler and his generals had based their entire Atlantic Wall strategy on a single premise, that the Allies needed to capture a deep-water port. This belief drove their deployment decisions. The heaviest reinforcements, armored reserves, and mobile divisions were concentrated near Pas-de-Calais, where they believed the main landing would occur. Cherbourg, though heavily defended, was seen as a likely early objective. What they didn't expect, what they couldn't accept, was that the Allies might bypass ports altogether. When Mulberry Harbors appeared, German commanders initially believed they were temporary, improvised, vulnerable. But after the storm of June 19th, when Mulberry B not only survived but increased throughput, it became clear. This was not a stopgap. It was strategy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had seen the danger early. He had warned Hitler that if the Allies gained a secure foothold and brought in supplies unimpeded, Germany would lose the West. Now in late June, he was proven right. Rommel pushed urgently for a counterattack, to collapse the beachhead, drive the Allies into the sea before they could mass armor and artillery. But time was gone. Every day, more troops arrived, more tanks, more fuel, more everything. The Mulberry Harbor made those counterattacks obsolete before they began. By July 1st, the Allied supply flow exceeded what German intelligence had believed was even possible without a port. Rommel's frustration boiled over. In July, he was wounded in an air attack and soon forced to resign. Days later, he would be implicated in the plot against Hitler. His vision of maneuver warfare, rapid counterattack, pinning the Allies on the beaches, had collapsed under the weight of logistics. The German command structure began to fracture. General von Rundstedt, commanding the Western Front, was removed after stating bluntly that the war was lost. German divisions were pulled from the Eastern Front, weakening defenses against the Soviets. In Berlin, Hitler refused to accept the new reality. He ordered panzer divisions to launch fruitless attacks in Normandy's hedgerows. Too late, too slow, too undersupplied. Meanwhile, the Allies kept landing over 7,000 tons of materiel per day directly into Normandy, with no port. By August, the Germans had lost Bayeux, Caen, and were retreating toward Falaise. The Mulberry Harbor, still operating, remained a symbol of Allied permanence on French soil. What began as a mad idea had become the platform for total liberation. Captured German soldiers, interrogated in late July, revealed their shock. One lieutenant confessed, "We thought the storm would stop them. Instead, the harbor survived. Then came more tanks, more guns. It didn't stop." Another prisoner, a sergeant from the 352nd Infantry Division, said, "It was like watching a machine land. Not an army. A machine." The sense of inevitability had set in. The Allies had not just outfought the Wehrmacht, they had outbuilt it. By September 1944, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. Paris was liberated. The Siegfried Line lay ahead. The Mulberry Harbor, still operational months later, had made this possible. It had erased the German timeline. It had invalidated their assumptions. And in doing so, it helped destroy the illusion of Nazi invincibility, not with bombs or tanks, but with bridges, piers, and the quiet strength of men who built a harbor where none should have stood. In war, we often remember the explosions, the battles, the firepower, the names of great offensives etched in history. But some victories are built with bolts, beams, and belief. The story of the Mulberry Harbor is not one of battlefield heroism or dramatic charges. It is the story of visionaries who imagined something impossible, and then built it in silence, under pressure, with lives depending on its success. It was an act of industrial faith, faith that floating concrete could stand against the channel, faith that steel roadways could bend with the tide, not break, faith that a port could rise not from land, but from the will to win. What the Germans mocked as madness became one of the most ingenious feats of military engineering in history. It didn't just support the invasion of Europe, it enabled it. No Mulberry, no Normandy, no victory in the West. The harbor did not fire a single shot, but it outlasted German guns. It delivered what the soldiers needed, when they needed it. It proved that imagination could be a weapon, that strategy could be forged in steel, and that preparation was more than half the battle. For those who fought ashore, it was a lifeline. For those who watched from the cliffs, German officers, stunned and powerless, it was the moment they realized the war was turning. Not because they were outgunned, but because they were outbuilt. And in the cold morning light of June 7th, 1944, as a harbor rose where no harbor had ever been, the future of Europe came ashore. One truck, one bridge, one floating miracle at a time.